Thank you, Mr. Chairman, distinguished members of the head table, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I'd like to thank IDSA for giving me this opportunity to share my thoughts with you. And the whole objective of my exercise is to try and benefit from the wisdom gathered around here and get some feedback, if not immediately in the question and answer session, but also at the various fellowships. Now, why I thought of writing about youth unrest is because in the last few years, I have been active in the so-called Track 2 deliberations, civil society deliberations in economic integration of South Asia. And the general tone has been that of great optimism, partly driven by the failure of the developed countries to maintain, sustain the momentum of growth and development, partly by the excitement generated by the expanding middle class in India as well as in Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. Now, I got the flavor, a similar sentiment from the Honorable Minister's address, inaugural address this morning as well. Now, just to give you a sample of the thought process, a very good book written, or rather edited by Ijaz Ghani of the World Bank, called Reshaping Tomorrow, Is South Asia Ready for the Big Leap? In that, in the overview section, authored by himself, page 4, he says, South Asia is well positioned to become the fastest growing region in the world, as growth will benefit from young demographics, new waves of globalization, increased labor mobility, and rise of the middle class. In 2020, South Asia will have the youngest population in the world. The median age in India will be 28 years compared to 37 in China and the USA, 49 in Japan, and 45 in Western Europe. The change in the age structure of the population will generate a demographic dividend. Ladies and gentlemen, this change in demographics can be a boon as well as a bane. Unfortunately, the Sri Lankan experience has been the latter. Now, those of you who are familiar with the with Sri Lanka will be aware that the demographic transition which is now sweeping across the whole of South Asia was experienced in Sri Lanka several decades ago. But let me get to the proper presentation. I'll briefly cover, I'm mindful of the time constraints. The whole idea is to try and see whether there are some lessons for the rest of the region from Sri Lanka, although Sri Lanka is a tiny bit of a 1.6 billion population. Sri Lanka is only 21 million people. Some lesser known facts about Sri Lanka, although a lot has been written. Then I get on to revolt. And as you will see, I see armed revolution or armed revolt in Sri Lanka as primarily a youth phenomenon, not an ethnic phenomenon as commonly, widely perceived and projected. So a little bit of the history of that, the beginning, divergence, and ending, all in brief. Details are found in my paper. The cost of that and the implications for South Asia. I already mentioned about the imminent youth bulge in South Asia and the enormous amount of excitement that it indeed be a boon right across the board. I said it can be a boon or a bane, and it can be a double-edged sword. We have to also bear in mind that South Asia has the largest concentration of poor in the whole world. But at the same time, we need to be aware that South Asia also has the largest concentration of conflict in the whole world, armed conflict. Now, you will see in my analysis that the reason for youth revolt may be purely domestic. That's the causes, the origins of the revolt, why people take to arms. But the feasibility of the revolt may also depend on certain external realities. So there are domestic as well as regional responsibilities for sustainable peace in South Asia. And that's a point I want to emphasize today. A lesser-known fact, also referred to by my colleague who spoke a little while ago, Professor Ranjit Bandara, Sri Lanka was affected by armed youth revolts in the north as well as in the south. Very few researchers have noted the fact that both had their beginnings in the mid-1960s at the same time. The southern one was very violent, peaked twice in 1971 and in 1987 and 89. Numbers affected are very hard to get an accurate fix on, but a lot of the numbers talked about are in fact deaths mentioned are similar in both the southern revolt and in the northern revolt. The northern one, however, continued for 20 more years, and we need to ask the question, why? As you know, theory of revolt, perhaps the oldest piece of work in the Western world, is the comments of Machiavelli in the 1500s, where he said that it is due to greed for power, for economic reasons. Now, the word greed may be a little too harsh, but it's simply that if you want to improve your lot, have more, then people may take to arms. But the more popular version theory was in the 1850s, where who was that now? Yes, Tocqueville talked in relation to French Revolution that a repressive regime results in revolt, right? In 1970, Ted Gurr, in his work titled Why Men Rebel, talked of this concept of relative deprivation. And that, in a sense, formalized Machiavelli's and Tocqueville's thoughts and articulated in a way where you can get a handle on, what exactly makes people rise up and take to arms. Now, a lot of the work on ethnic conflict have been based on these thoughts. relative deprivation in terms of economic power, political power, repression, all of that. And then, of course, if it is so high, comes to a stage where people feel, particularly the youth, because a particular sentiment which occurs among the youth is there's nothing to lose, there's everything to gain if we take to arms. And that's the point where people are pushed. However, relative deprivation, there's enormous number of examples all over the world. Probably the best in the teeming, overcrowded, poor cities of Asia. That relative deprivation alone does not make people take to arms and rise up in revolt. Ferran and Leighton, highly quoted work in 2003, pointed out that organizational, military, and financial feasibility determines revolt and its continuity. So, I don't have the time to elaborate. You know the references. I'm sure many of you are very familiar. The Sri Lankan experience can be easily explained by looking at the relative deprivation as well as the feasibility of revolt in the case of both northern and southern armed revolt in Sri Lanka. But you must also bear in mind that the feasibility, that is military, financial, and organizational feasibility, also depends on geographic factors, demographic factors, and geopolitical factors. So let me now back to Sri Lanka. In the 1940s to 50s, the death rate in Sri Lanka halved from 20% to 10%. Birth rate rose, and as a result, in the 60s to 70s period, the labor force increased. The rate of increase in the labor force doubled in the 60s to 70s. In fact, it increased from 14% to 31%. This happened at a time when Sri Lanka is following closed economy, government takes control of all the commanding heights of the economy, nationalization, and Sri Lankan economy grew at the lowest pace ever, at 3.1%. And ladies and gentlemen, it's no surprise then, right? With the labor force rising at 30% and the economy growing only by 3.1%, unemployment soared. And the greatest concentration of unemployed were in the rural areas, in the north and in the south. And it has been pointed out by some demographers, actually unemployment was higher in the south than in the north. But the point I'm trying to articulate is what drove the youth to take up arms in the north and the south was relative deprivation in the form of unemployment and long drawn out unemployment without a solution in sight. Now, how the northern youth understood this and converted into action was to say this is due to ethnic reasons, because the government of Sri Lanka is controlled primarily by the majority race. We are the minority. Therefore, we need to go for a separate state. How the southern youth explained this was saying this is a capitalist state, this is caste conflict, therefore we need to take arms and have a socialist revolution and recast the state. Then comes the question, how come then the southern revolt ended in 1989, and the northern one went on for 20 more years. And there comes the feasibility theory. Let me move to the next slide to help myself as well, so that I don't take too much of time. Yeah, I'll finish with this. The Northern Revolt was geographically and geopolitically favored compared to the Southern one. Both came with demographic factors. A demographic bulging and unemployment was the key deprivation. But Northern one was focused in a relatively small geographic area and just 30 miles away, a safe haven for rebels, and at times actively supported by the regime, at times not. Southern rebels did not have that. They were scattered all over the country. They also didn't have the massive forest belt in between. Those who study military strategy will be very familiar with that. And also there wasn't a diaspora. So the feasibility can be explained by those favorable geographic and geopolitical factors, and you can then easily understand why the Southern Revolt ended 20 years before the Northern. Now, lots of studies, I've quoted some of those. It may be argued over this 50-year period. I feel very sorry when people refer to 30 years of fighting in Sri Lanka. Ladies and gentlemen, it was 50 years, half a century. Sri Lanka may have lost 10 full years of GDP in opportunity cost terms. In the 50s, Sri Lanka was parallel in terms of economic development to South Korea, only second to Japan. So you can imagine, if you can draw a parallel there, what was the opportunity cost to Sri Lanka. To India, it is said that the Indian peacekeeping force lost 2,000 fighters, soldiers in Sri Lanka. They lost a political leader, Rajiv Gandhi. India is still paying for resettlement and reconstruction of the damage done to Sri Lanka. It's aid, but it's a cost, and money is fungible, right? It still has the possibility of causing instability in the South. Up to you to decide, the scholars in India, is that a big threat or a small one? But I think it has some possible influence. So the way forward is for individual countries in South Asia to choose a path of rapid economic growth so that the youth bulge will be productively, gainfully employed, and they will have things to lose rather than not have anything to lose. This requires, in today's context, greater regional cooperation and economic integration. Sustainable peace is not merely a country responsibility, not merely a single country responsibility. It is also a regional responsibility. Those two are interlinked at various levels, and I do not have the luxury of time to elaborate on it, but you will easily understand. Security concerns clearly retard economic integration is also can easily be explained. I have lots of examples to give. I'm not going to do it right now. Economic integration and the resulting prosperity can reduce reasons for revolt. Thank you very much.